The Washington Post is taking a closer look at the comments President Biden made during his first 100 days. What was true, what was false? So let's find out from the editor of the Washington Post, fact checker, Glenn Kessler, who is joining us now to talk about it. Glenn, good to see you. So let's explain to our audience, first of all, what method did you use to fact check the president? And tell us, of course, the big question that everybody's going to have is how President Biden compares to President Trump when it comes to false statements made specifically during the first 100 days of office. We all know how the last 4 years played out, but let's just talk about the first 100 days when things probably seemed a lot different than what they ultimately turned out to be.
That's right. That's right. In the first 100, we started a project with Trump, which was the first 100 days. It already became all 4 years, but first 100 days, President Trump made about 511 false or misleading claims. These are claims, we have a Pinocchio scale, so these are claims that would merit 2 Pinocchios or above. 2 Pinocchios is kind of, half true, out of context, stretching the truth, all the way to 4 Pinocchios, which is a whopper. So we used the same criteria for President Biden. I had just this morning done the final scrub through because there was an interview that he had yesterday, his 100th day, and it was aired this morning on a different network. And so the total in 100 days for Biden is 78 false or misleading claims.
And compared to the former president, do we have that number?
Yes, I said at the beginning, I thought 511. I'm sorry.
Oh, wow. Okay. So how much do you factor in the former president's use of social media? Is that also considered a claim? Because, I mean, one of the things that the previous administration had was just the sheer volume that was coming out of kind of official voices, but also the president himself on his Twitter feed.
Yes. For Biden, I mean, he has a pretty low-key Twitter feed. We looked at all the tweets. There was one tweet that we included as false or misleading. For the former president, I don't have it at the top of my head, but there were probably 56 or 60 claims, or no, maybe it was even almost 100 that could be attributed to tweets. And as the President Trump stayed longer in office, the claims just got more and more constant. So, on average, he had about 2,000 false or misleading claims every 100 days by the end. The last 100 days, just before the election, we counted almost 9,000 false or misleading claims. It was a rather burdensome thing to keep track of. So just keep that in mind. I mean, President Trump kind of started out relatively slow, and Biden, of course, is off to a super slow start. He doesn't have nearly as many interviews as Trump did in that period. He doesn't tweet as often. His speeches are shorter. He just had last night one campaign rally. I caught one thing in there that was made our list. Trump routinely had, I think he had like 3 campaign rallies in his first 100 days, and each of those added like 35 or 40 claims. By the end of his presidency, each campaign rally added something like 80 or 90 claims, because he never dropped a bad claim, he just would add more.
Glenn, it's so fascinating. I mean, 9,000 is an astronomical number.
I know.
But it's so interesting because on one hand you have, like, for example, during the address to Congress this week, you tweeted, that, and the president has often said this, that he traveled 17,000 miles with Xi Jinping, and so I retweeted that, and people got in my Twitter feed going, like, is this what you're focusing on? But as reporters, I mean, it doesn't matter what political party or who's in office. If the president of the United States says something that's not true, generally, I mean, that's the job of people who cover politics to point that out. But when you do look at the sheer number of false or misleading statements or outright lies that President Trump made that had real, I think, influence on policy, on government, on the Department of Justice, for example, claims that Obama wiretapped him, and it gets to the point where do you lend weight to the severity of the claim when you do the fact-checking post and when you write the fact-checker article for the Washington Post, or does that not factor in at all?
No, no, we definitely look at the severity, and the 17,000. I wrote about that because the president had said that. He's now said it at least 4 times, so it's obviously a number that he came up with. And one of the things we do is we check the numbers. On a routine day, Trump would say several things of that kind of, doesn't seem too important, but strange numbers that he was tweeting about or talking about, or something he saw on TV. And you're right. The one of the striking things about Trump was he affected so much policy and policy making with his false statements and his tweets. Biden has really held back in that way. He has, his cabinet secretaries do a lot of speaking on his behalf. The White House press secretary has 50, 60-minute briefings Monday through Friday, every day. So that's a lot of where the Trump administration's messaging is coming from. And Biden is not engaging in that way in people's faces the way Trump did.
Okay, so let's talk about the current president. One notable false claim made by President Biden was in regards to the voting laws that were recently passed in Georgia. According to your fact-checking, the president stated 3 times that the controversial laws would shorten voting hours. This particular falsehood earned him a 4 Pinocchio rating, something that you reserve for when a statement is completely untrue. Tell us, whether or not there is any sort of truth within that. Is it truth being misrepresented? Is it out of context? What are the president's aides offering to explain why he would repeat this claim?
Well, that's a good question. The Biden White House is generally very cooperative in terms of answering fact-check questions. This is one where I could not get much of an explanation. And the striking thing about this particular claim is it also came in an official statement released by the president. It wasn't just a statement made at a briefing or in a speech or a news conference. Mm-hmm. I recently evaluated a similar statement made by Stacey Abrams, where she was more careful and nuanced in talking about this issue. That earned her 2 Pinocchios. Something that her organization fiercely objected to. But the way Biden had put it was with no subtlety, basically that, voting hours were shortened. It had to, which didn't happen with the election day voting. It has to do with early voting. And actually, the experts I spoke to and studying the law said that for early voting, you could generally say that hours were expanded. So that's where the president got himself into trouble. But there was some basis there, but the way he phrased it was just straight out wrong.
So let's talk about another one. President Biden and members of his administration have claimed that President Trump had no plan and not enough supply to vaccinate the entire country. From where we stand now in the nation's vaccination efforts, the statement makes it seem as if the Biden administration delivered above and beyond what was expected. And I wonder if it's a fair statement, because when the president was a candidate for the presidency, he would say that. And I think that as somebody who's running for office, you say a lot of things on the campaign trail, to galvanize people to vote for you. But now that you're the president of the United States, to continue to repeat that, what have you uncovered? Was there a plan? I mean, I know what the reporting is, but when you're doing, again, the fact checker, was there a plan in place when it came to supplying and administering vaccines to the American people before President Biden took office?
Right. Yes, there was definitely a plan. I mean, this is, there's often a tendency of a new White House to kind of try to make a sharp break with the past. And, there's a philosophical difference between the two administrations operated. The Trump administration put a lot more onus on the states. The Biden administration has a much more top-down federal oversight. And I think you can generally say that they certainly sped up the tempo. They set goals. We're going to do 100 million shots, and then it was a goal of 200 million shots within 100 days. That's the kind of thing that you did not see in the Trump administration, because Trump was rather wary about kind of owning the problem in the way that Biden has decided to own it. But they did come into office. There was a plan out there that, and in fact, in terms of the vaccines, there were options to get more of the vaccines, which the Biden administration exercised. So what they did is they filled in the blanks of a plan that was there. And they sped up the tempo. You can't go back in time and say what would have happened if Trump had been reelected, obviously. It's one of those kind of. When Vice President Harris said something along these lines, we did a pretty extensive fact check, and we gave her 2 Pinocchios, which is, like I said, kind of like half true. There's a somewhat of basis for what they say, but at the same time, it's leaving out the things that they inherited from the Trump administration, which at the time they took office was doing an 7-day average of like 900,000 shots a day, which showed that it was certainly not starting from scratch.
On Wednesday night, the president delivered his first address to a joint session of Congress. You found 9 claims from that speech to be untrue or stretching the truth. Which one stood out to you as the greatest falsehood?
Well, I would say, the interesting thing is, what we have with this congressional speech is kind of a return to the way it was before Trump, where the president gives a speech carefully vetted. There are things where they may have stretched the truth a little bit, or they take things out of context, but generally you can expect that what the president says is carefully fact-checked before he says it. That was not the case with Trump, obviously. But where Biden got in trouble was when he ad-libbed lines that were not in his speech. So one thing you mentioned was the 17,000 miles. Another thing was he ad-libbed that most of the 11 million undocumented immigrants were visa overstays. Now, it is correct that the latest data shows that in recent years, most were visa overstays. But the president said the vast majority of 11 million were visa overstays. That's not the case. Those were mostly people coming across the southern border. And we don't actually have statistics yet for the breakdown between visa overstays and border crossings for 2019, and which was a big surge, or in the current months with the Biden administration. So that's just something where he ad-libbed it. He was basing it off of memory, and he got it wrong.
So, Glenn, you were actually touching on sort of the last question that I wanted to ask you. Could you, and I don't know if you can do this, but would you be able to sort of characterize the types of falsehood, misleading statements, range of Pinocchios that you found with the Trump administration versus what we've seen so far with the Biden administration? And I think you're kind of touching on something that I was thinking, because I was thinking, Joe Biden got himself in a lot of trouble on the campaign trail because of that folksy style, not a lot of trouble, but because of that folksy style where he would speak off the cuff, and then, every once in a while people would be like, what did he just say? And so, all incorrect statements are not equal. And Vlad brought this up about, the impact, whether you sort of gauge the impact. So if you could say, under the Trump administration, these were the vast majority of sort of falsehoods versus what we're seeing in the 100 days of the Biden administration. Would you be able to do that?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I should say we wrote a whole book on, Trump and his, assault on truth and his falsehoods. And he, in the case of Trump, it was just overwhelming, and there was constant repetition of false or misleading claims that just had no basis in fact. The biggest tax cut ever passed, or the greatest economy in world history, things like that were just were flat out wrong. The case of the Biden, Biden himself has described himself as a gaffe machine, and he, speaking off the cuff, he will sometimes really step in it. Such as when he claimed that he was, arrested while trying to see Nelson Mandela.
I remember that one.
And there was nothing to that. But at the same time, you see that the Biden administration, when they step over the line, they have actually responded to the fact checks. So earlier this year, Biden said his infrastructure plan would, the economy would create 19 million jobs, and he attributed that to a study. The study did say that, but most of those jobs would have been created with or without the infrastructure plan, and so the actual number of jobs created because of the infrastructure plan is 2.7 million. So after I wrote a fact check and other people wrote similar fact checks, Biden stopped saying 19 million. He just switched it to economic analyses will show millions of jobs will be created. So there you see, it's like I said, it's back to a more normal administration where they generally, they're going to spin a little bit or they're going to, obfuscate, but at the same time, they're going to try to be as factual as possible. It's politics, and sometimes they may even fix what they say because in response to fact checks.
I just got to say one thing, Glenn and Anne-Marie, that I think it's important to note that former President Trump, his dealings with the press long before he became president of the United States, long before he was a celebrity on The Apprentice, part of me wonders if, when he served as his own PR agent, John Barron, when he would leak things about himself or the Trump organization to tabloid news reporters, and even as he became more famous, when he would go on cable news to talk about things that received a lot of oxygen. In other words, he'd call up a tabloid reporter, he'd leak something, or he'd say something about one of his ex-wives or about his business or about how much money he had, and they would get printed in the newspaper. So his relationship with what we do as reporters was already, I think, I don't want to use the word damage, but it was skewed because he could say to himself reasonably, look, whenever I would call them and say something, they would print it and people would believe it. What's wrong? I think he carried that over, obviously, to the presidency without understanding the ramifications. But I think it's important to kind of note that relationship that he had with the press was already not balanced by the time he was elected. I don't know if you guys agree.
No, I completely agree. The other thing that I think he was shocked by was that people were holding him accountable for his statements. So, when he was a businessman, if he lied about his net worth to a bank, the bank didn't put out a press release and say Donald Trump lied about his net worth. They would just stop doing business with him, as many, many banks did. If he misled people about, an apartment building that he was selling, people might, demand their deposits back. But again, they didn't put out a press release and say, I was misled by the phony baloney propaganda having to do with this building. So in his previous life, there was not nearly the kinds of consequence to falsehoods as there was as president. And, he on 20 occasions, or more than 20 occasions, he spoke about how much he disliked getting Pinocchios. It really seemed to irritate him.
There's one way not to get a Pinocchio.
Already mentioned not liking Pinocchio, so it may be.
Well, because Glenn, he respected. I mean, deep down, it's clear that while he attacked members of the press, he called us enemy of the people. He said we were fake news. That there was nothing more important for President Trump to see a headline about him in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, to get an interview on 60 Minutes. Like for him, he's old school like that. That was a big deal. And, it probably pained him to no end to see him getting those Pinocchios like he did so often, 9,000 times, as you pointed out, towards the end there. Unbelievable.
Well, look, no one likes a Pinocchio, but there's one way not to get a Pinocchio. Just tell the truth. Luckily, we have Glenn with us to point it out when people don't. Glenn, I hope that we can kind of touch base with you along the way as you keep them honest, to take a phrase from someone else, keep the Biden administration honest. Thanks for joining us this morning.
You're welcome.